In the final months of World War II, Adolf Hitler himself began to doubt the men who once led the Panzer divisions, questioning their loyalty and abilities as Germany collapsed in a bitter end. After the capitulation on May 2, 1945, these military leaders faced an uncertain fate as prisoners of war. Many were captured by Allied forces, facing trials for war crimes, while others rebuilt their lives by writing memoirs of the Third Reich. Today, followers, we will see what happened to the German generals after the war. Hitler's fury, the Führer's final assessment of his generals. In the bunker beneath Berlin, Hitler's fury at his military commanders reached a peak. His increasingly delusional state led to fits of rage that left even his most hardened officers trembling. The Führer's distrust had become total, turning the German high command into a nest of perceived traitors and incompetents. Hitler's paranoia did not distinguish between success and failure. Even General Heinz Guderian, the father of Germany's blitzkrieg tactics, found himself on the receiving end of the Führer's wrath. During a heated meeting on March 28, 1945, Guderian dared to challenge Hitler's strategic decisions. The general accused Hitler of insufficient artillery preparation for a failed offensive near Kustrin and questioned the Führer's judgment. Hitler's response was swift and merciless. Guderian was immediately relieved of his post, his years of service and tactical brilliance dismissed in an instant. Even those who once held Hitler's favor were not immune to his capricious nature. After the failed Normandy campaign, General Gerd von Rundstedt found himself on the receiving end of the Führer's displeasure. When Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel asked Rundstedt for a solution to their predicament, the general's famous reply, "Make peace, you idiots," sealed his fate. Hitler quickly dismissed Rundstedt, unable to tolerate any suggestion of surrender or negotiation. At the center of this storm was General Helmut Weidling, a man thrust into an impossible situation. On April 23, 1945, Hitler appointed Weidling as the commander of the Berlin defense area. The general, who had previously led the 54th Panzer Corps, now faced the daunting task of defending a city with dwindling resources and a population on the brink of despair. Weidling's strategic acumen was immediately put to the test. He divided Berlin into 8 defense sectors, each under the command of a sector leader. But the challenges he faced were insurmountable. His forces were a motley mix of regular army troops, the Volkssturm militia, and members of the Hitler Youth, many of whom lacked proper training and equipment. As the Red Army tightened its noose around Berlin, Weidling made desperate attempts to hold back the Soviet forces. He orchestrated counterattacks and implemented desperate defensive measures, but the overwhelming Soviet numerical superiority and firepower rendered his efforts futile. In the bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, Weidling delivered grim reports to an increasingly disconnected Führer. Hitler's response to the deteriorating situation was a mixture of delusional optimism and bitter recriminations. As the battle raged above, Weidling struggled with the realization that continued resistance would only lead to more senseless bloodshed. Meanwhile, east of Berlin, another general faced his own trial by fire. Gotthard Heinrici, known for his defensive prowess, had been tasked with holding the Seelow Heights, the last natural barrier before Berlin. Heinrici's attempts to convey the hopelessness of his situation fell on deaf ears. In a tense meeting in April 1945, Hitler dismissed Heinrici's concerns with chilling optimism, declaring, "If you know that this battle must be won, it will be won." Heinrici's defense of the Seelow Heights was a masterclass in tactical ingenuity, but was doomed by the sheer force of the Soviet assault. As the situation in Berlin grew increasingly desperate, not all generals chose to go down with the ship. Ferdinand Schörner, one of Hitler's most fanatical followers, proved that even the most devout could falter in the face of certain defeat. Schörner, who had been promoted to field marshal in Hitler's will, chose self-preservation over loyalty in the final days of the war. In a startling act of desertion, Schörner abandoned his post and fled south, leaving his troops to face the Soviet onslaught alone. Schörner's flight was a final betrayal, a testament to the disintegration of the Nazi command structure in the face of imminent defeat. Walter Model, Death as the Last Refuge of Honor. In April 1945, Model found himself trapped in the Ruhr pocket, his forces surrounded by advancing Allied armies. The situation grew increasingly desperate as fuel and supplies ran low. On April 15th, the Allies split the pocket, further fragmenting Model's already beleaguered troops. As the noose tightened, Model made a fateful decision. On April 20th, he issued his last orders, allowing his soldiers to surrender or attempt to make their way home. It was an admission of defeat that went against everything he had fought for. But it wasn't this tactical withdrawal that sealed Model's fate. Instead, it was a devastating accusation from Joseph Goebbels on the same day, labeling Model and his men as traitors. The psychological impact of this accusation on Model was profound. His inner turmoil manifested in a bitter statement. "And these are the men I trusted. How many sacrifices have I demanded of my soldiers only to serve these swine?" The weight of perceived betrayal, combined with the crushing reality of defeat, proved too much for the once proud field marshal. On April 21, 1945, Walter Model walked into a forest near Duisburg. He bid farewell to his staff, his mind already made up. In those final moments, Model grappled with the enormity of his actions and the futility of further resistance. His last words revealed the depth of his despair and the rigid code of honor that had defined his military career. "I cannot imagine that I, as a field marshal, who by conviction in my country's victory am responsible for the deaths of hundreds of my soldiers, now must emerge from these woods to approach Montgomery or the Americans with my hands up and say, 'Hello, here I am Field Marshal Model, and I am surrendering.'" With these words echoing in the silent forest, Model raised his pistol and ended his life. The shot that rang out marked the final act of a man who could not reconcile his sense of duty with the reality of defeat. Model's aides, hearing the sound, rushed to the scene. They found their commander's body in a secluded spot, deliberately chosen to spare his men from witnessing their leader's final moments. Hitler's opinion of Model had changed drastically in those last days. Once valued for his crisis management skills, Model now found himself lumped with the other generals whom Hitler believed had failed him. The Führer's paranoia and rage, which had turned against many of his most competent commanders, now also darkened Model's legacy. Field Marshal Walter Model's body remained missing until a group of officers who had served with him and his son, Brigadier General Hans-Georg Model of the West German Army, discovered it near the town of Rattingen in 1955 and buried him in the German war cemetery at Vossenack, where he had won his great victory in the Battle of Hürtgen Forest. Thus, the genius who had earned the deserved nicknames Hitler's Fireman and Lion of Defense rested forever alongside his men, having become one of the best defensive commanders of both World War II and all of history. Albert Kesselring, from ruthless strategist to final judgment. As the Third Reich crumbled on all fronts, Hitler dismissed Kesselring as the commander of the Mediterranean Front on March 23, 1945, and appointed him commander-in-chief of the Western Front, a campaign already lost as US troops had breached the Rhine's protective margin after capturing the Remagen Bridge. Thus, with barely any forces left to resist in a geography unsuited to Kesselring's defensive tactics, the British quickly penetrated Denmark, and the Americans, led by General George Patton, reached Czechoslovakia. Unable to repel such offensives, the tormented Marshal barely managed to hold the front line between the central sector of the Elbe River and the mountains of Austria. He held out there until informed of Hitler's suicide and Germany's capitulation. Kesselring surrendered on May 9, 1945, in Salzburg, Austria, surrendering to General Maxwell Taylor of the US 101st Airborne Division, who offered him a very courteous and gentlemanly treatment. At the end of World War II, Kesselring was arrested and tried for war crimes in Verona. His charges were based mainly on the bombing of civilians when he commanded the Second Air Fleet of the Luftwaffe, and the abuse of some German troops towards civilians when they occupied Italy. Regarding the bombings of Warsaw, Kesselring defended himself by claiming he never intended to kill women or children. In Rotterdam, he argued he was unaware of the Dutch surrender before the attack, and for the raids on England, he claimed the fires covered the targets, causing bombs to accidentally fall on civilians. Despite such difficult-to-sustain statements, Kesselring was sentenced to death on February 10, 1947, but the sentence was commuted to life imprisonment on July 4, the same year, due to pressures from former enemies like British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and General Harold Alexander. He spent about 5 years in prison, passing the time by gluing paper bags with glue. Fortunately for him, on October 23, 1952, Kesselring was pardoned and released. Back in Germany, Kesselring reunited with his wife Louise in Wiese to dedicate himself to his family in his new retired life. During those years, he obtained the presidency of the Veterans Association of the Afrika Korps and later of the Luftwaffering, a group of retired aviators. He held a similar position in a far-right cultural group known as the Steel Helmets, Stahlhelm, whose branches extended across Germany and Austria. Simultaneously, he was a strong advocate of the European defense community, seeking to balance power against the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Simultaneously to his political life as part of veterans associations, he also wrote about his experiences in two key works to understand the past conflict titled Soldat bis zum letzten Tag and Gedanken zum Zweiten Weltkrieg. Unfortunately, on January 26, 1957, just after the death of his wife Louise Pauline, he had to abandon all his projects due to deteriorating health. Unexpectedly, on July 16, 1960, Albert Kesselring died at the age of 75 after a tough battle with throat cancer. Thousands of people and veterans attended his funeral in Wiese, passing by a bronze coffin where the old soldier lay in a Luftwaffe blue uniform, marshal's baton in hand, and the Knight's Cross with swords on his chest. Curiously, leading the procession were his adopted son, Rainer Kesselring, followed by former Chancellor Franz von Papen, SS General Sepp Dietrich, Ambassador Rudolf Rahn, Admiral Karl Dönitz, General Joachim von Peiper, and retired military Otto Remmer, all proudly singing the Steel Helmets anthem known as Ich hat einen Kameraden. Once the ceremony concluded, he was buried alongside his wife Louise Pauline under a tombstone bearing only his name, date and rank, but inside which lay a legend of World War II, von Kleist, the marshal who proposed peace and faced his final fate. In late October 1943, von Kleist was promoted to Field Marshal and put in command of the 17th Corps in Crimea. He proposed a tactical withdrawal on October 26th, which Hitler rejected to protect the Ploiesti oil fields. Von Kleist defended Crimea when the Red Army blocked the Perekop Isthmus on November 1st, and Soviet naval infantry landed in Kirch. In early 1944, Hitler allowed him to break the encirclement and escape Crimea, leaving behind many Axis troops. On March 30, 1944, Hitler summoned von Kleist to Obersalzberg, along with Field Marshal Erich von Manstein. Hitler awarded them the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross with swords, but also removed them from command. Von Kleist recommended a peace agreement with the USSR, but Hitler refused. For the rest of World War II, von Kleist led a peaceful and quiet life in his Villa Weidbruch estate in Silesia. Only a minor incident occurred when, after the failed assassination attempt on Hitler on July 20, 1944, the Gestapo detained him because a cousin was involved in the conspiracy, but he was immediately released when it was found he had no involvement. Unfortunately, the calm lasted only until early 1945, as von Kleist fled Villa Weidbruch ahead of the approaching Red Army, destroying his entire estate with explosives to prevent it from serving the Soviets. He and his family moved to Bavaria, hiding in Mitterfels until the war ended. Unexpectedly, on April 25, 1945, a patrol of the 26th U.S. Infantry Division captured von Kleist in Bavaria, interning him in the Trent Park prisoner of war camp. Later in 1945, the Marshal was sent to Britain, imprisoned as a British Army captive in the island farm camp numbered 11 in Wales. In 1946, he was extradited to Yugoslavia and sentenced to 2 years in prison by the new Yugoslav government under Josip Tito for organizing a war of aggression against Yugoslavia in 1941. After serving the sentence, instead of being released, he was handed over to the USSR by the Yugoslavs. Stalin deported him to Siberia. He spent time in various gulags and concentration camps until 1954, when he was sent to Camp Vladimir near Moscow, where he was allowed to write a monthly postcard to his wife. Having been in 27 different prisons over 9 years, von Kleist, already in poor health, succumbed to arteriosclerosis on October 15, 1954. Johannes Jürgen Christoph von Kleist, son of General Euwald von Kleist and a cavalry officer in the German army, survived captivity in the USSR, being released and returned to Germany in 1956. The Western Allies' decision to extradite the Marshal to the communist bloc of Europe sparked internal debate and even regret for treating a man of von Kleist's stature in such a manner. Oskar von Niedermayer, from adventurer to martyr of history. When the bomb plot against Hitler occurred on July 20, 1944, the Führer's hysteria extended not only to the guilty, but also to the innocent who had merely questioned his decisions, including Niedermayer. In August 1944, 2 Gestapo agents arrested the general, sentencing him to prison in Torgau, where he remained for 10 months, severely ill with tuberculosis. After World War II in Europe ended in May 1945, following Hitler's suicide and the Axis' surrender, US troops liberated Niedermayer from Torgau prison, only to hand him over to the Red Army, which unjustly accused him of crimes in the USSR. Niedermayer was transferred to Moscow's Lubyanka headquarters, where he was sentenced to 25 years of hard labor in a Siberian gulag under the name Oskar Fedorovich. His health, already delicate due to tuberculosis, deteriorated further from the cold, lack of medication, and mistreatment by Soviet guards, leading to his death on September 25, 1948, in Vladimir Prison near Moscow. Like Lawrence of Arabia serving the British Empire during the Arab Revolt, Oskar von Niedermayer played a similar role in Persia during World War I, though his feats didn't enter popular ideology, lacking the propagandistic reception, as he was on the losing side of the 20th century's major conflicts. His end was particularly sad, persecuted by Nazism, murdered by communism, and silenced by democracies. Despite this, his remarkable Afghan expedition, defense of colonized people's dignity, and creation of the Eastern Legions in World War II made him one of the most extraordinary military adventurers in contemporary history. Trials and executions, German generals facing war crimes. As the dust settled over the ruins of Nazi Germany, a new chapter began for many of Hitler's high command, one marked by trial, accountability, and in some cases, the ultimate price for their actions. The Allied powers, determined to bring the architects of war and genocide to justice, embarked on the arduous task of identifying, arresting, and trying those responsible for some of the most heinous crimes in history. Among the prominent generals who faced trial were some of the most infamous names of the Third Reich. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, who once headed the Wehrmacht High Command, found himself in the dock at Nuremberg alongside other top Nazi officials. Keitel's trial exposed the depths of his complicity in the regime's atrocities, including his role in implementing the infamous Commissar Order, which mandated the immediate execution of Soviet political officers. The trials of these generals were not confined to the grand stage of Nuremberg. In various corners of war-ravaged Europe, military tribunals convened to judge those who had carried out Hitler's orders with ruthless efficiency. One such case was that of General Anton Dostler. Dostler's trial, held in Rome in October 1945, focused on his role in the execution of 15 US soldiers. These men, captured while on a mission to blow up a railway tunnel, were summarily executed on Dostler's orders, in direct violation of the Geneva Convention. The general's defense, claiming he was merely following orders from above, failed to sway the tribunal. On December 1, 1945, Dostler faced a firing squad, becoming the first German general executed for war crimes. The case of SS General Jürgen Stroop presented an even more disturbing picture of Nazi brutality. Stroop, infamous for his role in crushing the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, was tried in Poland for his actions. The tribunal heard harrowing testimony about the methodical destruction of the ghetto and the murder of tens of thousands of Jewish civilians. Stroop's trial concluded with a death sentence, carried out by hanging on March 6, 1952, in Warsaw, a fitting location given his crimes against the city's inhabitants. For those found guilty, the end was often swift and ignominious. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, along with Colonel General Alfred Jodl, faced the hangman's noose on October 16, 1946. As the rope was placed around his neck, Keitel's final words were a last defiant "Alles für Deutschland," everything for Germany. Moments later, the trapdoor opened, and one of Hitler's top military leaders fell to his death. Erich von Manstein, from battlefield to courtroom. In the final days of the conflict, as Soviet forces closed in on Berlin, Manstein made a crucial decision. Rather than face capture by the Red Army, he chose to surrender to British forces in northern Germany. This calculated move would shape his post-war life, sparing him from the harsh treatment often meted out to German officers captured by the Soviets. Manstein's capture marked the beginning of a new battle, not on the muddy fields of Eastern Europe, but within the confines of Allied prisoner camps and courtrooms. The once proud field marshal, accustomed to commanding vast armies, now found himself stripped of rank and authority, subject to the whims of his captors and the scrutiny of war crimes investigators. The British wasted no time in subjecting Manstein to intense interrogation. Military intelligence officers sought to extract every detail possible about German operations on the Eastern Front, where Manstein had played a pivotal role. Manstein's trial, held in Hamburg in 1949, became a focal point for debates about military responsibility and the nature of following orders in wartime. The prosecution painted a damning picture of a commander who not only permitted but actively facilitated war crimes. Manstein, for his part, clung to the defense that atrocities were carried out by SS units not under his direct control, a claim echoed by many former Wehrmacht officers in the years that followed. During the proceedings, Manstein's own words came back to haunt him. He admitted to allowing reprisals against the wives of Russian partisan fighters for attacks on German soldiers, arguing that the civilians had employed all forms of illegal warfare, including wearing German uniforms and poisoning water supplies. These admissions, though perhaps intended to justify his actions, only served to underscore the brutality of the war he had helped wage. The verdict, when it came, was mixed. Manstein was found guilty on 9 counts related to the execution and mistreatment of Russian soldiers and civilians. However, he was acquitted of 8 other charges, notably those related to the extermination of Jews. The sentence, 18 years in prison, reflected the complexity of assigning individual culpability for the crimes of an entire regime. Upon his release, von Manstein had the opportunity to speak before the Bundestag of the Federal Republic of Germany to reorganize the post-war German army, now as a member of NATO. He soon regained his former general rank and devised defensive plans to protect the country against a possible attack by the German Democratic Republic under USSR tutelage. He also helped British journalist Liddell Hart compile his great encyclopedia on World War II and wrote a second set of memoirs titled Aus einem Soldaten, published in 1958. At the age of 85, Erich von Manstein died on the night of June 9, 1973, following a stroke. In gratitude for his services, Germany held a high-profile state funeral, honoring the old marshal as one of the great heroes of antiquity, Gerd von Rundstedt, the last years of the old Prussian. On May 1, 1945, as Allied forces swept through Germany, von Rundstedt's illustrious military career came to an inglorious end. The 36th U.S. Infantry Division captured the aging field marshal, marking the beginning of a new chapter in his life, one defined by interrogation, imprisonment, and finally a quiet retirement in the shadow of his former glory. The Americans wasted no time in seeking answers from their high-profile prisoner. Von Rundstedt was swiftly transported to Camp Ashcan, a temporary detention center housed within the opulent Palace Hotel in Bad Mondorf, Luxembourg. The field marshal's journey through captivity took him across a war-torn Europe. From Luxembourg, he was moved to Grisdale Hall in the picturesque Lake District of England, a stark contrast to the devastation left behind on the continent. Later, he found himself interned at Island Farm in South Wales, where he joined other high-ranking German officers in contemplating their fall from power and the uncertain future that lay ahead. As Allied authorities sifted through mountains of evidence, von Rundstedt's name emerged in connection with war crimes. The charges against him were serious, centered on his knowledge and endorsement of the infamous Severity Order, issued by Field Marshal Walter von Reichenau. This order had led to mass killings in Soviet-occupied territory, casting a dark shadow over von Rundstedt's military legacy. However, fate would intervene on behalf of the aging general. As the wheels of justice turned, von Rundstedt's advanced age and deteriorating health became increasingly apparent. The once vigorous commander now struggled with the physical toll of imprisonment. his condition worsening in the damp British climate. Faced with the prospect of trying a man who might not survive the proceedings, Allied authorities made a crucial decision. In July 1948, after 3 years in captivity, Gerd von Rundstedt was released. In the early post-war period, life was very hard for Rundstedt and his family, who were then living in Celle. Due to Germany's ruin, all members were penniless, his wife Bela was ill, and he was an old man without strength. Despite these hardships, British military historian Basil Liddell Hart, along with former German General Günther Blumentrich, provided him with money to survive until the Federal Republic of Germany's government finally agreed to grant him his war pension. The 1950s marked an improvement in the life of Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, who began helping numerous historians recount the events of World War II in their works and encyclopedias. These specialists included his friend Basil Liddell Hart and filmmaker Leo Carroll, whom he advised for the 1952 film Rommel, the Desert Fox. On February 24, 1953, Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt died of a heart attack in Hanover. To date, his military figure had earned praise from opponents such as General Dwight Eisenhower, who had said, "We have always regarded Field Marshal von Rundstedt as the most skilled German commander." Heinz Guderian, from Panzer General to military historian. As Allied forces closed in on Berlin, Guderian made a calculated decision. On May 10, 1945, he surrendered to US troops, narrowly avoiding capture by the vengeful Soviet Red Army. The Americans, recognizing Guderian's military expertise, quickly subjected him to intense interrogation. He was moved between several detention centers, including Camp Ashcan in Luxembourg and facilities in England's Lake District. These sessions, though exhausting, allowed Guderian to showcase his tactical knowledge and distance himself from the regime's worst atrocities. During his captivity, Guderian's sharp mind remained active. He began formulating plans to preserve his legacy and reshape the narrative of his wartime experiences. In a surprising twist of fate, Guderian found himself working for the very forces he had once fought against. The US Army's Historical Division, eager to glean insights into German military tactics, turned to him for expertise. Released from captivity on June 17, 1948, Guderian emerged into a vastly different world from the one he had known as Hitler's favorite general. Settling in the Bavarian town of Schwangau, he dedicated himself to rebuilding his life and reputation. In 1951, Guderian published his seminal work, Erinnerungen eines Soldaten, known in English as Panzer Leader. This memoir, carefully crafted to present a sanitized version of his wartime experiences, became a cornerstone of post-war military literature. In its pages, Guderian sought to portray the Wehrmacht as a professional fighting force distinct from the atrocities committed by the SS, contributing to the myth of the clean Wehrmacht that would persist for decades. On May 14, 1954, exactly 14 years after his breakthrough in the Ardennes at Sedan during the 1940 French campaign, General Heinz Guderian died in Schwangau, Bavaria. With his death, the founder of the Blitzkrieg and the father of future modern wars throughout the 20th century passed away. The Waffen-SS generals, a harsher fate. A grim fate awaited a particular category of Hitler's commanders, the Waffen-SS generals. Unlike their Wehrmacht counterparts, these men faced a harsher reckoning, their crimes considered more heinous, their association with the darkest aspects of the Nazi regime undeniable. The distinction between the Wehrmacht and the Waffen-SS was stark and significant. While the Wehrmacht represented the regular armed forces of Nazi Germany, the Waffen-SS operated as an elite combat force under the direct control of Heinrich Himmler and the SS. This separation would prove crucial in the post-war period as Allied prosecutors sought to unravel the complex web of responsibility for the atrocities committed during the Third Reich's reign of terror. In the damp cells of Allied prisons, the Waffen-SS generals found themselves facing a litany of charges that went beyond the usual scope of military defeat. They were accused not only of waging aggressive war, but of crimes against humanity, mass executions, ethnic cleansing, and direct participation in the Holocaust. Among these fallen commanders, the fate of Sepp Dietrich stood out as a stark example of the price paid for loyalty to Hitler's most fanatical military arm. Once a feared and respected leader of the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, Dietrich now faced the grim reality of Allied justice. Accused of war crimes for his role in the Malmedy massacre, where American POWs were brutally executed during the Battle of the Bulge, Dietrich's fall from grace was swift and merciless. The Malmedy trial, held in the shadow of Nuremberg, exposed the brutal nature of Waffen-SS operations. Witnesses recounted how Dietrich's men had gunned down unarmed American soldiers in a snow-covered field, a blatant violation of the Geneva Convention. Despite attempts to shift blame and claims of following orders, Dietrich could not escape the weight of evidence against him. However, not all Waffen-SS generals shared the same fate. Paul Hauser navigated the treacherous waters of post-war justice with surprising dexterity. Known as the father of the Waffen-SS, Hauser's post-war strategy focused on rehabilitating the image of his fallen comrades. He sought to draw a distinction between the combat units of the Waffen-SS and the concentration camp guards, arguing that the former were simply soldiers fulfilling their duty. Hauser's efforts to present the Waffen-SS as a fourth branch of the Wehrmacht, separate from the regime's atrocities, found some resonance in the complex political landscape of the Cold War. He became an advocate for veterans' rights, writing memoirs that sought to reshape the narrative around the Waffen-SS. One of the best German SS military leaders was Herbert Otto Giel. Recognized for his tactical skills and abilities, Giel commanded Waffen-SS units at the regiment, division and corps levels with distinction during the war. Giel was popular among his men for his personal bravery and was known for the cane he frequently carried. As the war drew to a close, Giel surrendered to US troops to avoid capture by the Soviets. He was a prisoner of the Americans for 3 years until his release in May 1948. After the war, he worked for a newspaper until 1958 and also ran a small bookstore. Giel founded a magazine for veterans of the Viking Division, the Vikingruf. On December 26, 1966, Herbert Otto Giel died of a heart attack in Stemmen, near Hanover, and was buried in the local cemetery of the town. The only SS general tasked with defending Berlin was SS Obergruppenführer Felix Steiner. In May 1945, with Germany's surrender, Felix Steiner was imprisoned by the Allies, later released by the British. After regaining his freedom, Steiner worked to improve conditions for SS veterans and wrote numerous books about his combat experiences, the most famous being Armee der Geachteten, Army of Outlaws. In 1953, the CIA recruited Steiner to found the Gesellschaft für Wehrkunde, composed of former German military officers. This organization served as a propaganda tool and think tank for the rearmament of West Germany, leading to the Bundeswehr. Felix Steiner died in Munich, Bavaria, on May 17, 1966. Karl Wolff was one of the highest-ranking SS generals after Heinrich Himmler and Ernst Kaltenbrunner. Arrested on May 13, 1945, Wolff was imprisoned in Schöneberg. During the Nuremberg trials, he was allowed to avoid prosecution in exchange for facilitating early surrender in Italy and testifying for the prosecution. Released in 1947, he was charged by the post-war German government as part of the denazification process. Under house arrest, Wolff was sentenced in November 1948 to 4 years in prison. After his release, he worked as an executive in an advertising agency and moved with his family to Starnberg. In 1962, during the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Israel, it was revealed that Wolff had organized the deportation of Italian Jews in 1944. He was tried again in West Germany and in 1964 convicted of deporting 300,000 Jews to Treblinka, leading to their murder. Sentenced to 15 years, Wolff served only part of his sentence and was released in 1971. After his release, Wolff retired to Austria. In the 1970s and 1980s, he returned to public life, giving lectures about the inner workings of the SS and his relationship with Himmler. He appeared in television documentaries, including The World at War, where he claimed to have witnessed the execution of 20 or 30 partisan prisoners in Minsk in 1941 with Himmler. In the 1970s, Wolff promoted the theory of a supposed plot to kidnap Pope Pius XIV. Most accusations of this plot are based on a 1972 document written by Wolf and published in 1991 by Avvenire d'Italia, as well as personal interviews with Wolf before his death in 1984. Wolf claimed that on September 13, 1943, Hitler gave the directive to occupy the Vatican City, secure its archives and artistic treasures, and take the Pope and the Curia to the north. Allegedly, Hitler did not want the Pope to fall into Allied hands. Wolf's reliability has been questioned by Holocaust historians, such as Istvan Dijk, a professor of history at Columbia University. Reviewing A Special Mission by Dan Kurtzman, a promoter of the theory, Dijk noted Kurtzman's credulity and that he uncritically accepts the validity of controversial documents and believes without question in statements made by his main German interlocutor, former SS General Karl Wolff. Additionally, Dijk criticized the book's modest documentation, which contains a great many vague or inaccurate references. In the 1970s, Wolff also became involved with Stern journalist Gerd Heidemann. They traveled together to South America, where they helped locate, among others, Klaus Barbie and Walter Roff, whom Heidemann interviewed for a series of articles. Wolff served as a consultant for the supposed Hitler diaries and was deeply affected when they were revealed to be forgeries by Konrad Kujau. Wolff refused to attend Heidemann and Kujau's trial. Karl Wolff died on July 17, 1984, in a hospital in Rosenheim. Friedrich Jeckeln was one of the senior SS officers during World War II, known for his brutality and efficiency in implementing Nazi extermination policies in the Ostland territory, which included the Baltic states and part of Belarus. Jeckeln was captured by Soviet troops near Halbe on April 28, 1945. Along with other German officers, he was tried by a Soviet military tribunal in the Riga trial in Latvia from January 26, 1946 to February 3, 1946. During the investigation, he remained calm, answering investigators' questions clearly, and on the bench he appeared bored and impassive. Jeckeln's final words were moderate, fully admitting his guilt and accepting full responsibility for the activities of the SS and SD police in Ostland. Concluding his speech, he said, "I must bear full responsibility for what happened within the borders of Ostland, within the SS, South Dakota, and Gestapo. This greatly increases my guilt. My fate is in the hands of the Supreme Court, so I only ask that it considers mitigating circumstances. I will accept a sentence with full repentance, which I will consider a deserved punishment." Jeckeln and the other defendants were found guilty, sentenced to death, and hanged in Riga on February 3, 1946, in front of about 4,000 spectators. Contrary to popular misconception, the execution did not take place in the former Riga ghetto, but in Victory Square, Uzvaris-Laukums. Children of war, tragic and glorious destinies in the shadow of the marshals. Günther Guderian, son of General Heinz Guderian, was born in 1914, the year World War I broke out. From a young age, he was determined to follow in his father's footsteps. By age 21, he was in the Wehrmacht and participated in the campaigns of Poland and France, where he was wounded twice. In 1942, he graduated from the Staff College and served in various Panzer units. In May 1944, he joined the General Staff of the 116th Panzer Division, remaining there until the war's end. In October of that year, he received the Knight's Cross for his bravery in the Battle of Falaise. He participated in the Battle of the Bulge and the battles in the Hurtgen Forest. The war ended for him in April 1945 with the surrender in the Ruhr Basin. Released in 1947, he returned to the army in 1956 as a commander and reached the rank of Inspector General of Armored Forces, the same position his father held. Günther retired in 1974 and died in 2004 at age 90. Manfred Rommel, son of the legendary Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, was born in 1928. Manfred was too young to enlist in the German army during the early campaigns. In 1943, at only 14, he was sent as an aide to the Luftwaffe to help in Germany's air defense. It is said that he wanted to join the Waffen-SS, but his father prevented it. After his father's death, Manfred was transferred to the Reich Labor Service in March 1945. He deserted before the French First Army reached his position. After the war, he studied law and political science, later holding various political positions, including mayor of Stuttgart in 1974. Manfred died in 2013 at age 84. Erich von Manstein's son, Gero, was born on the last day of 1922. Despite being described by his father as a fragile asthmatic child, Gero did not let his condition hold him back. Inspired by his family's military heritage and the fervent nationalism of the time, he decided to follow his father's path. In 1941, Gero joined the invasion of the Soviet Union as part of the 18th Motorized Infantry Division. During the relentless Operation Barbarossa, he rose to the rank of corporal. This unit fought tenaciously in Army Group Center until the brutal winter set in. Gero returned to Germany to attend officer school, graduating as a lieutenant before being sent back to the Eastern Front. After several months of convalescence, he joined the 18th Panzer Division in the summer of 1942, stationed near Leningrad under Army Group North. Fate saw his father sent to the same area after the capture of Sevastopol. On August 27th, he stood at the gates of Leningrad, ready to lead an assault that never materialized. 2 months later, on October 23, 1942, Gero perished under his father's command at age 19. This tragic event was a devastating blow for the marshal who, without time to mourn, had to face the critical situation of the German army encircled in Stalingrad. Hans-Georg Model, son of Walter Model, had a more fortunate fate. Born in 1927, Hans could not join the German army until 1944, when the war was already ending. At 17, he enlisted in the Wehrmacht Reserve in December 1944. He spent the first months of 1945 receiving basic military training while studying to become an officer. The war ended before Hans could see combat. After World War II, Hans obtained a journalist's license and studied law at the University of Bonn. However, in 1956, he decided to join the Bundeswehr. He graduated as a lieutenant in 1957 and began a military career that led to him becoming a brigadier general in 1980. As a general, he directed the Bundeswehr's intelligence office until his retirement in 1987. Hans-Georg Model died on April 16, 2016. Friedrich Paulus's son, Friedrich, also named Friedrich, reached the rank of captain during World War II and died in February 1944 at the Battle of Anzio. According to historian Anthony Beevor, his son's death was a decisive factor in Paulus, held by the Soviets, signing a call for Germany's surrender. Paulus saw the war as a lost cause, continuing only meaning more pointless deaths of German soldiers like his son. The other son, Alexander Paulus, also a captain, fought in the Battle of Stalingrad and was trapped with his father, though he was evacuated due to his wounds. In August 1944, when his father signed the mentioned document, Alexander was arrested along with his mother and imprisoned until the war's end. He later helped draft the book Stalingrad, published in 1960. Alexander committed suicide in 1970 at age 52, the same age his father was when he surrendered at Stalingrad. Heinrich Hitler, nephew of the German leader and son of Alois Hitler Jr., was born on March 14, 1920. From a young age, he was close to the National Socialist movement and his uncle. In 1939, at 19, he enlisted in the army and became a signals non-commissioned officer of the 23rd Potsdam Artillery Regiment in 1941. He participated in Operation Barbarossa and, during a mission in 1942, was captured by the Soviets. Tortured in Butyrka prison in Moscow, Heinrich died in February 1942 at age 21, without revealing valuable information, leaving a final act of resistance against an unyielding fate. Escape to South America. Generals who evaded justice. As the Allied noose tightened around Nazi Germany, a select group of Hitler's generals made a crucial decision. Instead of facing capture and possible execution, they chose to flee, embarking on a dangerous journey that would take them far from the ruins of the Third Reich. Their destination, the vast expanses of South America, where they hoped to find refuge and escape the long arm of justice. Among those who successfully evaded capture was Johannes Steinhoff, a high-ranking Luftwaffe officer who had commanded fighter squadrons. Steinhoff, like many of his compatriots, used the infamous rat lines, a clandestine network of escape routes orchestrated by the shadowy organization Odessa and sympathetic members of the Catholic clergy. Steinhoff's journey took him to Argentina, a nation that had maintained a policy of neutrality for much of the war. There he found himself in the company of other Nazi fugitives, all struggling to build new lives while constantly looking over their shoulders. In South America, the former generals adopted various strategies to avoid detection. Many lived under false identities, shedding their military titles and decorations in favor of more mundane personas. They became businessmen, farmers, and laborers, blending into the fabric of their adopted communities while harboring dark secrets from their past lives. The case of Walter Rauff exemplified the complex reality these fugitives faced. Rauff, a former SS Standartenführer, found refuge in Chile, where he lived openly under his real name. Working as a businessman, Rauff managed to evade justice for decades, his presence an open secret in certain circles. However, the relative safety these men enjoyed was not absolute. The capture of Adolf Eichmann in Argentina in 1960 by Israeli Mossad agents sent shockwaves through the Nazi exile community. Eichmann, a key architect of the Holocaust, had been living under a false name in Buenos Aires when he was snatched off the street in a daring operation. As the years passed, the number of Nazi fugitives in South America dwindled. Some, like Walter Rauff, died peacefully in their adopted homes, their crimes unpunished. Others were eventually tracked down and brought to justice, their captures making international headlines and reopening old wounds. The hunt for these men became a lifelong obsession for some, with Nazi hunters like Simon Wiesenthal dedicating decades to uncovering their whereabouts and bringing them to trial. Captured by the Soviets, the fate of Friedrich Paulus. While some German generals met their end defending Berlin or chose suicide as an escape, others faced a different fate: capture by the advancing Soviet forces. Among these was Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, whose surrender at Stalingrad had dealt a crushing blow to Hitler's Eastern campaign. Hitler had promoted Paulus to Field Marshal on January 30, 1943, a calculated move implying that the general should take his own life rather than surrender. In Hitler's eyes, no German field marshal had ever been captured alive. However, Paulus defied these expectations. On January 31st, he surrendered to the Soviets, disobeying Hitler's implicit order for the first and last time. The Führer's reaction was swift and vitriolic. He declared Paulus a coward, stripping him of all honors and condemning him as a traitor to the Reich. For Paulus, capture by the Soviets marked the beginning of a long and complex journey. Initially sent to a special camp near Moscow, he found himself under the watchful eye of the NKVD. Recognizing the propaganda value of their high-ranking prisoner, the Soviets wasted no time in exploiting Paulus's capture. Recordings of his interrogation were disseminated worldwide, serving as a significant psychological blow to Nazi Germany. As the war progressed, Paulus found himself at a crossroads. Initially resistant to Soviet attempts to change his allegiance, he refused to join the National Committee for a Free Germany, an anti-Hitler organization formed by German communists and POWs. However, the failed assassination attempt on Hitler in July 1944 proved to be a turning point. Perhaps seeing an opportunity for redemption, Paulus eventually agreed to join the resistance against his former Führer. This decision would have far-reaching consequences for Paulus in the post-war world. The Soviets, eager to capitalize on their star prisoner, used him as a key witness at the Nuremberg trials. In a dramatic twist, Paulus testified against his former comrades, including Hermann Göring. He attributed the disaster at Stalingrad to Göring, citing the Luftwaffe's failure to adequately supply the besieged Sixth Army. More significantly, Paulus admitted his own complicity in planning Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. This confession marked the first time a high-ranking German military leader openly acknowledged the criminal nature of the campaign, sending shockwaves through the proceedings and further cementing Paulus's break with his Nazi past. After the Nuremberg trials, Paulus's fate remained intertwined with Soviet interests. He was kept in Moscow for years after the war ended, only allowed to return to Germany in 1953, following Stalin's death. The field marshal's choice to settle in Dresden, East Germany, rather than reunite with his family in the West, raised eyebrows and fueled speculation about his true loyalties. Lessons from history: the legacy of the German generals. As the ashes of the Third Reich settled across Europe, the fate of Hitler's generals became a complex tapestry of justice, evasion, and bitter endings. Their stories, interwoven into the fabric of post-war history, offer stark lessons about the consequences of blind obedience and the weight of moral responsibility in times of conflict. In the aftermath of World War II, the German generals faced a variety of fates, each serving as a sobering reminder of the price of complicity in the Nazi regime's atrocities. Some, like Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel and Colonel General Alfred Jodl, met their end on the gallows, their lives extinguished as punishment for their roles in the crimes against humanity perpetrated by the Reich. Others, like Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, found themselves in Soviet captivity, their military expertise now used against their former comrades as they testified at the Nuremberg trials. The legacy of these men extends far beyond their individual fates, casting a long shadow over military ethics and leadership in the decades that followed. Their actions, or in many cases inactions, in the face of Hitler's genocidal policies raised profound questions about the nature of duty and morality in wartime. The trials and testimonies of the German generals exposed the hollowness of the just following orders defense, challenging deeply ingrained notions of military honor and obedience. As Cold War tensions mounted, some former Wehrmacht officers found themselves in an unexpected position. Men like Heinz Guderian, once celebrated for their tactical brilliance, now served as advisors in the reformation of the West German army. This pragmatic approach by the Western Allies highlighted the complex realities of post-war geopolitics, where former enemies became reluctant allies against a new perceived threat. The impact of these generals' experiences on military doctrine and leadership cannot be overstated. Their stories serve as cautionary tales, reminding future military leaders of the importance of moral courage in the face of unjust orders. The concept of innere Führung, or internal leadership in the modern German Bundeswehr, arises as a direct response to the ethical failures of the Wehrmacht leadership, emphasizing personal responsibility and moral decision-making within the military hierarchy. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the German generals lies in the broader historical lessons drawn from their experiences. Their fates underscore the dangers of authoritarianism and the consequences of surrendering individual moral judgment to the dictates of an oppressive regime. The trials and testimonies of men like Erich von Manstein and Friedrich Paulus helped shape post-war perceptions of Nazi Germany and the Wehrmacht, challenging the myth of the clean Wehrmacht and forcing a national reckoning with the past. When Field Marshal Keitel stood before the gallows, his final words, "Alles für Deutschland," everything for Germany, rang hollow in the face of the atrocities revealed during the Nuremberg trials. His execution, along with those of his fellow officers, served as a stark reminder of the price of complicity in crimes against humanity. The fates of these men, from the gallows to prison cells and quiet retirements, stand as a testament to the complexities of accountability in the aftermath of total war. The stories of Hitler's generals continue to resonate today, offering valuable insights into the nature of leadership, the importance of ethical decision-making, and the consequences of moral failure in times of conflict. Their legacy serves as a somber reminder of the depths to which humanity can sink and the long shadow cast by the decisions made in the crucible of war.